a co-host, and you can share your slides. And while you're doing that, okay, let me let me kick off, okay, by introducing you to, well, I don't have to, but because everybody knows you, but let me say a few things. First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Thank you for being so supportive of the center. Really appreciate it. Now, Jim Alm is currently Emeritus Professor of Economics at Tulane University, having been there as a professor in a chair since 2010. Prior to this, he has held positions in other top universities in the US. Jim says focus on public economics. He has worked across many themes, from tax compliance to marriage taxes, opportunity zones, corruption, fiscal decentralization. I still remember I came across Jim's work back as a graduate student in the 1990s with a really nice paper in Why People Pay Taxes, and I think that was the first paper that was making a point that people overweight the probability of auditing. And that was really inspiring at that time. Coming at the back of the Alicam and Sadmo story. Now he has been, it's a long list, incredible CV. He has been the recipient of many awards and honors, the latest being President-elect of the National Tax Association. Of course, he was, many of you might have dealt with him as an editor of Public Finance Review, long-serving, many years, and other editorial boards. The thing that is amazing with Jim is that how prolific as a scholar he has been. He has written maybe more than 200 peer-reviewed papers. His CV says 173, but I'm pretty sure that there's a long lineup of papers in the in the pipeline. 11 books and monographs, 51 book chapters, and the list goes on and on and on. Out of curiosity, I checked his citations using Google Scholar, nothing sophisticated, and he's just short of 20,000, which is amazing. Now his research, of course, has been published in leading economics journals such as the AER, Journal of Economic Perspectives, Review of Economics and Statistics. Again, there's a long list. As I said, personally, I would like to thank him because he's very supportive of the center. Every time he can, every time he's asked, and he's very keen to support us. He has been an international fellow for the center. Came back in 2016. He was here in 2016 where he gave another plenary lecture. It's an honor to have him back. I thank you very much for accepting, Jim. Looking forward to the lecture, and the floor is yours. Thank you. I appreciate.
Thank you, Christos, and thanks to everybody at TARC for a wonderful, if challenging, conference. Holding these things virtually is a challenge, as I will know after the National Tax Association Fall Conference, which was a virtual conference, and our Spring Symposium last year and this coming year is likely to be a virtual conference as well. I don't yet have screen sharing enabled.
I've given you that. Let me try again. Let me check. I apologize for that.
While you're doing that, let me emphasize, as you'll see when I put my slides up, this is joint work with lots of colleagues who are far smarter than I am on behavioral economics issues, including, I believe Eric Kirchler is on this Zoom presentation as well. Eric's one of the co-authors, along with Kay Blaufas and Martin Folkman and Peter Moore and Nina Olson and Benno Torgler. many of whom I've worked with in the past as well, especially Benno. Okay, here we go. So let me do one thing here. In any event, I think the work here dovetails nicely with the very nice earlier panel discussion on what's going on in Africa, for example, and what the administrative procedures are that the tax administration is pursuing. In particular, the starting point for this paper is that governments have taken really truly remarkable measures during the SARS COVID-19 CoV-2 pandemic with multiple policy dimensions, along multiple policy dimensions. And in this paper, what we do is we analyze these government policy choices. What we're trying to do is focus on two questions, and focus on these two questions from a behavioral economics perspective. First, what is the impact of tax policy measures taken to combat the economic consequences of the pandemic on the perception and valuation and behavior of citizens? In other words, how do people see these policies and perceive their effectiveness of policies? And then second, what needs to be done in the future to ensure a high willingness to cooperate with the state and a commitment to pay taxes in society? In other words, how do these policies affect tax compliance? And so again, throughout what we do is we take a behavioral economics perspective. And I will say that I will focus a little bit more in this presentation on the compliance impact of the policies rather than the perceived effectiveness. But in order to talk about the compliance impact, we need to talk about how people are perceiving these policies and whether they think these policies are effective and how that might affect compliance. And again, I think many of the points made by the wonderful panel about what was going on in Africa, I think emphasize a lot of these points as well. So here is my roadmap. I'm going to talk about briefly tax policy measures in response to the crisis, the perception and effectiveness of these tax policy measures, again, trying to invoke behavioral economics, the acceptance or non-acceptance of these tax policy measures and how that might affect compliance, including invoking some of the work that in particular Eric Kirchler and Benno Torgler and I have done in the past on different frameworks for thinking about how government should and can improve compliance. And then move on to what do these things suggest about behavioral strategies to maintain citizens' willingness to cooperate and pay taxes, and finish with some conclusions about my own speculation on what I think are likely to be some of the effects of the pandemic on compliance. I will say again throughout, this is not my usual presentation. Usually I will be presenting a particular research project or focusing especially on the compliance literature or the marriage tax literature or the whatever literature. This is far more speculative. And so I and my co-authors are engaging in speculation on what we think are likely to be the perceived effectiveness of these policies and how this will affect ultimately compliance. I at least reserve the right to change my opinion if the facts should change, as John Maynard Keynes once said. So let me start with the tax policy measures that have been invoked to deal with the crisis. Now, I don't expect you to read very carefully all these different policies. Many of these were policies that were mentioned in the panel discussion about Africa. Many of these are policies that have been mentioned in the other nice papers at this conference. You can see throughout there that there are a variety of things about in aiding business, extending tax filing, giving money to people, giving tax incentives for depreciation and investment, changing tax rates, giving tax waivers and tax credits for specific consumption items. Let me simply emphasize that ignoring automatic stabilizers and ignoring any behavioral economic, or excuse me, structural economics changes that have been suggested, including some recent ones by Reuven Abiyona from University of Michigan on increasing the excess profit taxes or strengthening the corporate income tax, or structural changes. I'm not dealing with those. I'm focusing more on these short-term policies that are not really so much stimulus in many cases, but are more intended to be relief. Difference between stimulus and relief. And I think they fall into 4 classifications according to what the OECD information they've collected and how they classified them. First are policies to enhance firms' liquidity. Second are policies to support employment in those firms. Third are policies to support investment. And fourth are policies much more targeted at individuals in order to maintain consumption. Specifically, the policies that fit in here, and here's, again, I don't expect you to pay a lot of attention to these things, but you can kind of get an idea of which policies have been more likely to be enacted. So policies to enhance firms' liquidity, enhance tax loss offset provisions, enhance tax refunds. You can see a list of the countries that have enacted those. Non-renewable grants or subsidies for non-wage business costs, tax filing extensions, tax rate reductions, tax waivers. These are some of the main policies that have been enacted to enhance firms' liquidities. Policies to support firms' employment. Here's, for example, where the forgivable loans, that's where, for example, the U.S. Paycheck Protection Program would be enacted. And to the extent I discuss any of these things in detail, I will, with regrets and apologies, just focus more on U.S. policies, wage subsidies, things like that. Policies to support firms' investment, accelerated bonus depreciation, a corporate income tax rate reduction, increased R&D tax incentives, reduction of withholding taxes, tax credits and tax breaks. Again, you can see that countries of variety levels of income and economic development have enacted those. And finally, policies to support consumption. These are the policies that are targeting more directly individuals and trying to give them income to get through their loss of employment or their unemployment. So for example, the US major program has been enhanced or extended eligibility for unemployment insurance, tax credits, tax waivers, cash transfers. These have been enacted in the US as well. $1,200 check as it was paid to individuals, for example. So again, for focusing on the US, the US policy, for example, the CARES Act, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which was enacted back in March 27th, was an extraordinarily large relief bill of over $2 trillion that enacted and gave cash benefits to individuals, $1,200, as I mentioned, increased unemployment benefits. In fact, for many people, they paid off to be unemployed rather than go back to work, given the combination of the unemployment benefits and the unemployment insurance that they were already entitled to. Paycheck Protection Program, which was forgivable loans to businesses. And all these were increased in subsequent legislation as well. $500 billion of aid for large corporations, much of which has been abused, for example, according to evidence. $340 billion to state and local governments who have been particularly hard hit. There are currently, there are some additional programs as well. Families First Coronavirus Response enacted in March 18th was about $200 billion. There is currently under discussion a further relief pack in the US, a further relief package of about $908 billion that will be voted upon in, I think, a couple days if things proceed as expected. Whether or not that actually gets passed remains to be seen. It's not as large as Democrats in Congress would like. It's larger than Republicans in Congress would like. We'll see actually what happens there. So how are these various tax policy measures being perceived? Excuse me, how can we evaluate the effectiveness of these tax policy measures using behavioral economics considerations such as salience? The changes have to be visible, complexity. The verdict is still a little bit out on this conclusion, but I'll put this in here. People are less likely to change their behavior when incentives are overly complex. Framing, people are affected by whether something is framed as a gain or a loss, or a tax versus a fee. And timing, people are influenced by the timing of incentives, especially when they use mental accounts. So do the benefits roll in immediately, or do they phase in over time? And when you look at these considerations give a pretty mixed evaluation of the effectiveness of these tax policy measures based upon behavioral economics considerations to address the pandemic. And the effectiveness depends on the specific country design features and whether or not we think the design of these programs appropriately takes into consideration behavioral economics considerations. So let me just give you a couple of examples that illustrate this, focusing on tax measures to aid individuals to stimulate consumption. There's some experimental evidence that people are willing to spend more if a tax reduction is framed as a gain, as a bonus, instead of as a tax rebate, in other words, a foregone loss. This is in line with the principle, I think, of tax aversion. Subjects attach a higher value to a loss reduction setting, and this will save more and spend less in that kind of setting. If governments aim to stimulate consumption, what they should do, based behind behavioral economics, is that they should frame any of these tax reductions as a gain, because it might be more successful in stimulating consumption than framing it as a loss. Similarly, spending behavior is affected by the way in which a tax cut is delivered. Is it administered as a lump sum payment, or as monthly amounts phased in over time? There's some evidence that the proportion of a lump sum spent is less than tax refunds of the same amount that are phased in over time, although one can get opposite behavioral conclusions as well. One explanation for this is mental accounting. If an inflow of money is small and immediate, it might go into people's current income account. It means that, in which would be used for consumption, whereas inflows in the asset mental account would be primarily used for savings. So monthly, I think I misstated this, so monthly withholding tax reductions are more likely to be allocated to the current income account, which would be spent. And a one-time payment, however, could be larger and therefore more salient, and so it'd be more likely to be spent. So there are a variety of considerations that factor into this. And one last example. What about the tax rate reductions? Research shows that consumption taxes that are not included in the price, but instead are adjusted at the register when people pay, tend to be ignored or underweighted. Raj Chetty's work going back 11 years is the most famous example of that. Thus, the effectiveness of any rate reduction, especially value-added tax rate reduction, is going to be higher if tax-inclusive prices are displayed. Furthermore, the magnitude of these tax rate reductions, I think, needs to be large enough to get people's attention. A rate reduction that is reducing the tax burden by a couple $100 relative to a tax expenditure that is required to get that of $20,000 or euros, whatever, is less likely to have an impact than something that is more salient. So all of these considerations, again, give a mixed evaluation of the effectiveness of these tax policy measures, depending upon how they're designed. And all we're arguing in this paper is that these behavioral economics considerations need to be considered. What about the acceptance of tax policy measures, and how might this affect compliance? Well, the perceived effectiveness of these tax policy measures is almost certain to have a wide range of effects on tax compliance, especially, we believe, through various channels, but especially acting through people's trust in government. So to help to understand this, here is going to be a very, very brief review of the findings of the theoretical and empirical research on what motivates tax compliance. If you want a more extended version of this, you should see my fairly recent Journal of Economic Surveys paper, 2019, and a even more recent paper with Antoine Malazou that does a meta-analysis of these experimental economic literature. This could be obviously an entire lecture or even an entire conference. So I'm going to give you one slide that summarizes these things, summarize these main results. And again, we can go into more detail, more questions, and if people wish to pursue this in more detail. But I think the main findings of this literature, this entire theoretical and empirical literature, behavioral and non-behavioral and such, is first of all, people are influenced by narrowly defined and individually based financial considerations, including the chances of getting audited and the penalties on audits if you are detected. Although the effects of audits are far more nuanced and far subtler, I think, than the traditional thinking would suggest. Second, individuals are also strongly influenced by non-financial considerations: sympathy, empathy, patriotism, emotions, guilt, shame, morality, social capital, social norms, things like that. That plays a decisive role in many people's decisions. Individuals are influenced by information, by the ways in which they process this information. Information on what the government is doing, information on what the tax administration is doing on enforcement, information on what their neighbors and peers are doing. Individuals are influenced by social considerations, trusts, especially in government, and social norms and public goods relating back to non-financial considerations and motivations. And finally, I think a crucial consideration is that individuals are different. They can't be represented by a single representative agent. If you do that, you're going to miss lots of nuances. They have to be considered a collection of different segments in which one person may be in different segments at different points in time, may switch, may be motivated by different things at different points in time. And so, in other words, there is a full house of individual behaviors in which people's behavior differs by motivation, by demographics, by their perception of what government is doing, on and on and on. And again, check out my survey for 12 bullet point summaries of this theoretical and empirical literature. So how can these insights, many of which are derived, not all, but many of which are derived and certainly are inspired by behavioral economics considerations, be used by a tax administration to improve compliance, especially during and following a pandemic? Well, I think this literature, these results suggest that to improve and maintain compliance, you need detection and punishment, along with other tools. Other tools would include government or tax administration should provide services to make it easier for agents to pay their taxes. Although, again, the literature on that is not entirely resolved, shall we say. And the tax administration and the government itself must be seen as trustworthy, treating people fairly and honestly and giving people something for their taxes. These, I think, are the crucial insights. And in other words, what government needs to do is use a framework based upon power or enforcement and trust and services. All this must be part of an overall strategy to ensure compliance. In other words, you need a full house of administrative strategies to address the full house of individual behaviors. And what this leads to is the famous slippery slope framework developed by my good friend and collaborator and colleague, Eric Kirchler, that, and I won't go into much detail on this, but what it argues is that the interaction climate between taxpayers and the authorities shapes people's willingness to cooperate based upon the trust and the power of in this relationships. In a framework characterized by high trust in the authorities who act with high legitimization and professionalism, taxpayers are willing to cooperate voluntarily. In an antagonistic framework characterized by low trust, poor legitimization, questionable professionalism, low trust, taxpayers refuse to cooperate unless compliance with the law is enforced via power. So taxpayers' compliance depends upon the power of the authority and the trust in the authority, with both dimensions moderating each other and determining the level of compliance. An authority with a higher level of power, in particular, can achieve enforced tax compliance. An authority that elicits strong trust from their citizens, in particular, can achieve high voluntary compliance. So that's one framework. And the evidence from some recent work by Eric and even more collaborators that are on this paper from a variety of countries demonstrates, I think, the validity of this. Another framework that is very similar, that emphasizes these three dimensions more explicitly, I think, is one that I've developed with Benno Torgler, an enforcement or power paradigm, which is consistent with the slippery slope, increased detection and punishment to increase compliance, service paradigm, the tax administration. There's a role for the tax administration as a facilitator and a provider of services to taxpayers. So improve the services of the tax administration by becoming more consumer friendly. And finally, regardless of whether it's enforcement or services, people are more likely to respond if they believe that government generally and the tax administration specifically are honest. Trust in the authorities can have a positive impact on compliance. So change the culture or the social norm. So what are the likely effects of these various tax policy measures that I mentioned earlier briefly, and how they are perceived using these two broadly similar frameworks, and emphasizing in particular the trust that people have in government and the power and enforcement of government, and then finishing more with the fact that people are different, individual traits and situational characteristics. So what about the impact of policy measures on the trust in the authority? And in particular on these dimensions, the perceived effectiveness of tax measures, the procedural justice of tax policy measures, the distributed justice of these measures as well. Well, what about the perceived effectiveness and the retributive justice? Let me focus first on the perceived effectiveness. If individuals accept these tax measures and feel confident, if they perceive that they are effective in combating the negative consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, the government will be perceived as acting professionally, and trust in the government will increase. In contrast, if they don't think these measures are effective, they're not going to respond accordingly. So which is it in countries around the world, and based upon the nice panel discussion again in Africa, for example, or in Europe for that matter? Well, focusing on where I have a little more experience in the US, the government response has, I think, widely been viewed overall as ineffective, as a huge opportunity lost by government. And in fact, it's arguable that the perceived ineffectiveness of government policies cost Donald Trump the election, given the narrowness of his defeat in especially some states. New Zealand, I think it would be widely perceived as having an effective response. Germany, perhaps the same. UK, I won't venture any guesses there. I'll leave that up to my colleagues from Exeter and so on. What about the procedural justice? People need to think that they have been treated fairly by the procedures and the processes that are set by the policies. There's substantial evidence on tax compliance that the way in which the tax authority treats individuals, whether it's seen as treating them fairly and with due process, affects compliance. Procedural justice is seen as an important determinant of tax compliance. What about distributive justice? Who gains and who loses from these policies? I'm sorry, one last comment on procedural justice. Again, in the United States, there are many groups in some states who do not feel that the processes have treated them fairly. And they have gone to court in order to, for example, get the courts to allow them to be seen as essential businesses and to open up their businesses along with the essential businesses of grocery stores and hospitals and so on. They don't think they've been treated fairly, and that's clearly had an effect on, I think there will have an effect on their willingness to comply. Ditto on distributive justice. If people think that the benefits and the costs of these measures are being unfairly borne by them, they will resist and they will comply less. If they think that everybody is bearing the brunt of these burdens, and they're more likely to comply. And again, in the US, groups have gone to court thinking that they've been unfairly targeted. And this has had massive negative effects on their solvency. There's also evidence that wealthy taxpayers, for example, who don't need that $1,200 cash transfer that the government provided in the CARES Act, have nonetheless gone ahead and gotten it. And I think people perceive that as being unfair, and that's going to affect their view of distributive justice. And retributive justice, I think the government needs to be seen as is targeting people who are cheating the system. And if the people widely perceive that, I think the compliance will increase. If they think that these efforts are not being undertaken, or if the efforts are going against people who shouldn't be targeted, then I think that's going to have a negative effect as well. And what is it in the US? Again, the evidence suggests that there are many individuals who think that they're being unfairly targeted. Overall, then, I think there is increasing and newly emerging evidence. And I have, 20 sites here that I could go through, but I won't in the interest of time, on recent research during the pandemic itself that demonstrates the role of this trust as an essential feature in the response of any country. Social capital that's affected by this trust is enormously important in the pandemic. Its policies and its politics have had pervasive effects on trust, sometimes positively. In the US, I think sometimes negatively. Just as the two that I will mention, the two that I will mention, there was a recent editorial in the Washington Post by a grand old man of American public policy, revered by both Democrats and Republicans, George Shultz, who just turned 100. And he said, and I quote, "The most important things that I've learned is that trust is the coin of the realm. When trust was there in the room, good things happened. When trust was not in the room, bad things happened. Everything else is details." And this was followed up by an op-ed in the New York Times by Bret Stephens, a conservative op-ed writer, who cited the George Shultz paper and said, citing some of this empirical research, but citing in particular George Shultz, in high trust societies like Canada or Sweden, people tend to flourish. In low trust societies like Lebanon or Brazil, they do not. Trust is absolutely crucial. What about power? Well, the retributive justice clearly feeds into this as well. Related closely to retributive power is the impact of these measures on the power of the authority. What's happened to the detection probability? Well, in many countries, African countries especially, I think, the budgets of the tax administration have been dramatically affected. Certainly in the US, the budget of the IRS has declined significantly over the last 10 years. So the ability to detect people has been decreased based upon audits and so on. The flip side, though, is that a lot of these relief measures are being delivered electronically, and there is that paper trail. And whether or not people perceive that, there clearly is the enhanced technological capability, at least if there were sufficient budgets, of the authority to detect fraud, given that they know precisely who's getting this assistance and this relief and not. And so which is it in the US? Budgets have fallen, third-party information has increased. And those go in opposite direction. What about the impact of individual traits and situational characteristics? Well, we're talking about tax morale. How are people's tax morale affected? That's going to depend upon how they think they've been treated and what they view about how the pandemic reflects the ability of government to respond appropriately. What about their risk attitudes? Are they more likely or less likely to engage in risky behavior based upon how the pandemic has affected them? There are a variety of other considerations that we discuss in the paper. Emotions, I won't discuss all of these in the same detail, but let me mention a couple of them. The emotions, I think, are important. In particular, the pandemic has elicited, I think, fear and anger, and the response in compliance to fear and anger are quite different. Fear might arise because people are afraid of the possible severe consequences of the pandemic on their health. in their economic situation. Anger might might arise because perceived ineffectiveness or unfairness in the way in which policies have been enacted. And these have different effects. While fear increases risk aversion and therefore tends to lead to more compliance, anger is likely to have the opposite effect. And so emotions, and Eric has done some path-breaking work on the impact of emotions with some of his colleagues on this. Other behavior, I think that's also crucial. If you see others, for example, wearing masks, you are more likely to wear masks as well. More generally, if you see others obeying the law and obeying the shutdowns, you are more likely to obey as well. When you see the president flouting mask behavior, or the chief executive, I won't make it personal to the US, or when you see others actively encouraging people not to wear masks, then your compliance with the mask mandates and lockdowns and your compliance more broadly is going to be, I think, discouraged. And so here is kind of a summary information sheet, the table of all of these effects that are in the paper: the trust in the authority, the effectiveness of tax measures. And in general, these go in opposite directions. I should have said here, tax measures perceived as effective increase compliance, as ineffective decrease compliance. Ditto throughout this. If for example, on procedural and distributive justice, if people think that they've been treated unfairly, they won't comply. If people think they've been treated fairly, they will. If the penalties are well targeted, people will comply. If they're poorly targeted, they won't. Detection probability, moral balancing, all these other things in general have conflicting effects depending upon, but predictable effects, depending upon how people perceive the effectiveness of these policies. So all this then leads to a suggestion for several strategies that government might pursue and should pursue based upon this evidence that can affect compliance, based upon results from theoretical and empirical work on what motivates compliance. So first of all, and none of these I think are particularly path-breaking, but I think it's useful to have them organized in a particular way. First of all, government needs to communicate. The first rule of crisis management is communication. It's important to provide people with clear information about all behavioral restrictions and economic stimulus measures taken by the government, especially the rights and the obligations of people to comply. New Zealand was, I think, famously successful there. I think the evidence from the US, based upon a recent book published by Bob Woodward, is that the administration generally and the president specifically did not communicate clearly and honestly with people. And that's not a strategy for dealing with the pandemic. And I think that set the stage for the US government response that has been widely seen as ineffective. The government needs to justify clearly and transparently. Again, the economic stimulus packages financed by money need to be justified. Their likely effects need to be clearly communicated, and the justification should be based upon scientific evidence and not simply one's gut reaction. Keep things simple. Again, the evidence isn't entirely clear-cut on this, but I think, at least in the context of compliance specifically, if you make it harder for people to get assistance and relief, they're not going to get it, and they're going to then think that the measures are ineffective and they won't comply. Provide services. This is part of the paradigm that of tax administration that Benno and I came up with, not simply regarding taxes, but services more broadly. That I think is going to, if people think that they are getting something and something that they deserve, then I think they're more likely to comply. And these services need to take into consideration individual differences. One size fits all doesn't usually make an appropriate strategy. Use controls and penalties. You got to go after the people who are cheating, who are getting this assistance fraudulently and illegitimately. I could tell you some personal stories there, but that would probably get me in trouble. So I will bypass those. And this is harder for a tax administration whose budget has been slashed. Target these controls. Again, the use of technology makes targeting better. and more effective. The budget losses of tax administration makes this less likely. Reward tax compliance. There's a good bit of research going back to some experimental work that I did a long time ago with Mike McKee and Betty Jackson that suggests that positive rewards may be more effective in stimulating compliance than negative penalties. And there's been some more recent research, mainly in the laboratory, but also with field studies that suggest this. Establish cooperation as a socially binding norm. I think that's essential. I think it's also probably the hardest of any of these tax policy measures to implement. Again, that could be a whole conference. So how can the government improve cooperation? Trust is crucial in here, but are there specific things that government can do beyond that? Recognize that framing affects choices. So take advantage of behavioral economics considerations in designing tax policy. Plan for the future. Recognize that we're dealing with unknown unknowns. The pandemic, it remains a mystery, but nonetheless, one needs to plan for the future, using the best information that one has. And finally, recognize that when you evaluate these policies some time from now, evaluate them given the uncertainties at the time. And don't try to revisit things and point fingers at individuals for bad policies. So conclusions here, and here's where I'll finish. Hopefully I haven't gone too much. I'm about at 35 minutes, so even though we got started late, this will be quite quick. How will these tax policy measures enacted during the pandemic be perceived? How will these measures affect future tax compliance in the post-pandemic world? This was actually the paper, an empirical paper that I was hoping to write for this keynote and for this plenary, with a lot of these considerations that I've discussed, but with some hard empirical, well, hopefully hard empirical evidence on this. I've actually been communicating with a former student of mine on developing a dynamic growth model to incorporate norms and trust and compliance and see how different measures might affect that. I've also been discussing this with a colleague about trying to generate empirical estimates of this. And it's easy to say we don't really know, but I think an empirical piece based upon the best available evidence and based upon some of this evidence that's emerging, I think would be quite useful. On balance, and here's my bottom line here, and here's what my empirical work I hope would address. On balance, I think there will be increased compliance in a post-pandemic world, largely because there's improved technology and there's the increased tracking ability, electronic payments to recipients. There will, however, be decreased compliance, largely via, at least in many countries, via reduced trust in government and perceived ineffectiveness of government responses, reduced budgets, and that could go in other directions depending upon whether or not the government has done a good job, reduced budgets for enforcement activities, which is pretty much across the board, and reduced income and greater unemployment, which is also pretty much across the board, and there's empirical evidence on how people respond to that. So I was hoping to bring these major considerations together and make some individual country-specific predictions and some broader predictions as well. That remains to be done. The next steps, therefore, require measuring these effects. And still, I will conclude with one cautionary note. We're living in a world with what Frank Knight referred to as uncertainty, not risk, which would be referred to as known unknowns, but uncertainty. We simply don't know. There are unknown unknowns that will affect how economies evolve in the future. A year ago, no one had any idea that this pandemic was going to be inflicted on us, and no one had any idea that the effects would be so unbelievable. You know, a year later, after the initial, about a year later, we're still dealing with this. We're still on shutdown in many cases. No one had any idea this would happen. And so it's hard to make predictions. Nonetheless, I remain confident that some of this work could yield some insights.
You synthesize and also the message that you come across in the communication, is important. Clear communication, accurate communication, and simple communication has been, is really important, especially for. Okay.
Let me briefly respond. To some extent, I emphasized, given my own interest and given a good bit of the focus of the paper, I focused on the compliance impact. To be honest, that's important because government has to have the resources to respond appropriately. On the other hand, it is clearly not as important as making sure that individuals have money to eat and money to pay their rent, and businesses have money to keep people employed. And so the effectiveness of these measures more broadly on providing relief should be, I think, the dominant consideration. And there I'll simply say that governments that have established a trustworthy relationship with their citizens have a good bit more leeway to maneuver and to achieve some success in dealing with that than governments that have bungled the pandemic response.
Yeah.
And that relates to governments that have pursued presumably some of those 11-point strategies that we suggest: communicate, treat people honestly and fairly, and so on and so on. That should, I think, be the dominant consideration. And that's also then what the paper does discuss, and I didn't spend a lot of time on that, is that's where I think behavioral economic considerations can also help in the design of some of these policies.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Let me open the floor for questions, and I see quite a few in the chat box, Jim. Would you be able to read those?
I can now.
Okay.
Let me go back to, if I can. Let me treat them in the order in which I've received them.
Absolutely, yes. 635 is the first one.
Okay, from Hamawan. In the surveys on tax compliance, empirical evidence on intrinsic non-financial motivations are mostly found in laboratory experiments, but rarely observed in the field. Can you say about the external validity of evidence? I would actually disagree with that. I think there is increasing evidence from randomized controlled trials. The World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank has been finding in Latin American countries in particular that suggests that there is in fact intrinsic motivation. At least the results are consistent with that kind of motivation. More broadly, there is reason to be skeptical of results from the laboratory. I will grant that point. I will say, though, that the work that I've done, including with IRS people, that's looked at the external validity of laboratory experiments, suggests that student subjects are real people too. That their cognitive processes are the same as real people. They don't have the same experiences, and that can affect things, but their cognitive processes are the same. And so to the extent that we are looking at how people are processing information and drawing policy implications from that, there shouldn't be any difference. And that's consistent, very consistent with our comparisons of lab experiments results with real world taxpayers. Now, I will acknowledge that Gareth Miles has an empirical paper that demonstrates, it concludes the opposite. I won't go into the details there. I disagree with the design of that experiment, but nonetheless, not everybody agrees with this. So I think it's a fair question. Another question from Hans. How can you establish cooperation in a highly polarized society such as the US? That's what I was referring to when I said, how can you increase trust? How can you increase social capital? There's no obvious immediate effect, way of bringing that about. And in fact, again, I don't like to quote popular press, but there was a large op-ed piece in the New York Times today by Thomas Edsall that's addressing exactly this issue of polarization and citing evidence from political scientists and sociologists about increasing polarization in the US and being not completely pessimistic, but largely pessimistic on the possibility of reforming that anytime soon. It's taken us a while to get to this position. We're not going to get out of it quickly. The only way I think you can start is by toning down the rhetoric and hopefully, and whether or not that's going to happen is clearly remains to be seen. A new president coming in may have some positive effects there, but Joe Biden is going to have difficulty dealing with the very disgruntled, non-trivial minority of people who believe that the election was not fair. So I don't have any good answers there, other than I'm a believer in simplicity and honesty and transparency, and I think government that would follow those procedures would ultimately be successful. But it will take a while to get back to that point. What's the relation between health policies and economic relief policies and the impact on societal trust? Again, I think that works mainly through the notions of justice that people might have if they think that if they have their health insurance taken away by an act of Congress or a decision by the Supreme Court, I think people will see this as not fair to them, unless it's replaced with something that's even better. As a Swede, our high trust in society is usually said to be one explanation that we accept high taxes. Do you think it will be diminished given that we've had very high mortality? I don't know. I think that a one-time blip in the way in which the effectiveness of government policies are perceived in Sweden, and despite what it is still the case that I had some results here. Hang on. It's still the case that the response in Sweden is to the lockdown response and the mortality response is better than in many other countries. The deaths per 100,000 people as of just yesterday are 74 in Sweden. In the US, they're 92. In the UK, they're 97. The death rate, the case for fatality rate, actually is a little bit higher in Sweden than in the US, 2.3% rather than 1.8%. But nonetheless, I think government is being seen in Sweden as taking into consideration people's expressions of satisfaction or not. I don't think a one-time blip on that is going to dramatically affect the way in which the government in Sweden is perceived. That's a guess. That's a guess. I mean, I'm being speculative here. If there is a massive up spike in death rates in Sweden, I reserve the right to change my opinion. I don't think that's going to happen. But when the facts change, you got to change your. If you're a believer in science and evidence-based policy, you need to change your opinion. I reserve that right. I think that's all the questions I see.
Any other questions for Jim? Please put them in the chat box. But I completely agree with your assessment that okay, there are two effects pushing in completely opposite directions. One is the tax authorities are going to become more digitalized, so compliance is going to get better. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you was something that we picked up yesterday in the other plenary was the enhanced digitalization of society becomes more digitalized as a response to the pandemic. Countries do within a year. I mean, they do what they should have done 15 years back. So there's this forced digitalization, and so how do you expect at the end of the day, things to shape up in terms of compliance, in terms of trust, in terms of there are so many issues about legitimacy, in terms of the legal aspects, information, who holds the information and things like that.
Several observations. One is that the experience of specific countries is going to differ. There's not going to be one generalization that applies. People are too different. Countries are too different. Institutions are too different. The perceptions of government responses are too different. The degree of trust in the ability of government to do the right thing is too different across countries. And so there's not a one size fits all strategy. That I will suggest that some broad conclusions nonetheless in countries that are perceived as bungling the response, however you want to measure that, in terms of deaths, in terms of lack of transparency, in terms of any of these dimensions by which the COVID-19 virus is being evaluated by health experts. If government is perceived as bungling that, then I think that's going to significantly erode trust, and that's going to significantly decrease compliance. And in fact, you see evidence of this in these studies that I briefly mentioned that are emerging. As I think it was Julian mentioned, the pandemic is obviously a humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah.
It is also an opportunity to do path-breaking research on the ways in which different policy responses can achieve different results.
Yeah.
And so, for example, there's a recent paper, Pandemics and Social Capital, that go back looking at the 1918-1919 worldwide flu pandemic that demonstrates that the pandemic led to long-term deterioration in social trust, with demographic losses and a permanent loss in economic growth. There's work by Durante et al., Civic Capital and Social Distancing, based upon Italy's experience, that in regions in Italy that had greater social capital measured by standard measures, people were more willing to obey lockdown and regulations and stay at home based upon individual mobility data from cell phones. Again, it's a tragedy, it's a catastrophe, but there is research that can shed light on what these effects might mean. There is also research that suggests an appropriate and efficient and fair response of government has led to people's willingness to accept these lockdowns and therefore increase compliance. So it's really going to depend very, very much on individual country circumstances. That's why, in the aggregate, can we make predictions? In the aggregate, actually, my guess would be is that compliance is going to decline because trust is going to in government. But I think there will be strong and significant exceptions to that, and in particular in countries that have demonstrated an appropriate and efficient and a fair response, and in which the trust in government institutions and the ability of government to provide services and the ability of government to get people who are cheaters detected, there's where you're going to have a positive impact on compliance.